please help me welcome Connor Beaton to the Magic Hour.
Woo woo. Hi.
Connor, real quick, I just wanted to tell you, my boyfriend's been in your Alliance Men's group for about a year or so. And after I interviewed Vienna, I pushed him to get in it because I felt like it's so cool too. I think men's work can be so intimidating for men, but not only because of COVID, but because yours is virtual. I felt like this is a good first step. It's virtual. It's less intimidating. And I was also asking him what questions do you think we should ask Connor? And he was super excited when he answered, oh, you could ask him anything. He knows everything.
So you have a lot to hold up today.
Right. No doubt. I mean, there's definitely some area, if we start to venture into quantum mechanics, my knowledge is fairly limited in that department.
Well, it's really cool that someone that's been in your men's group that long, describes you in that way. So
that's an honor. Yeah, I appreciate that. And I appreciate you sending in my way. I think a lot of men do come into the work, right? Working on themselves, developing themselves, often because of a woman in their life, whether it's their partner, whether it's a friend, a colleague. But, I usually I've spoken at quite a few women's events, and the question is always, how do I get my man to go into this work?
Yeah.
How do I get him to go to therapy or get a coach? And I usually say, you're the permission card holder, but you can't be the forcer. You can't force your man or any man in your life to venture into that territory. It has to be his own choice. He has to have a desire and a want to enter into that work. But sometimes men are just looking for permission to go and do it from someone, to acknowledge yeah, I think you could probably benefit from that, or you could probably learn from something from that. And so I appreciate
okay.
Yeah. And that it's okay. You're not, I think for me in the past, I always had the perspective, if I needed that help, I was broken and that there was something fundamentally wrong. And that honestly, I think a big part of it was that I was afraid in some way, and I see a lot of men struggling with this. I was afraid in some way that women would think negatively of me, or that other men would have a viewpoint that I was less of a man. And I think what I've learned is that it actually has equipped me to be able to be in relationship in a stronger way with women and with other men. And I think that a lot of
it's the opposite.
Yeah, absolutely. So I just wanted to toss that out there before we get into the thick
I think
of
my
things.
method, I would anytime our podcast mentioned men's work, I'd be editing that podcast right next to him, just make sure he was overhearing it. And then what was really helpful, because I really, like you said, was trying to be that permission slip of him entering the growth path. But what was amazing when he got in your men's group, because you were the introduction, he hadn't done anything yet. He's since joining your men's group, he's done a lot of other stuff, but that was his very first step onto the growth path. And I think what was really cool that he received from that was not only the feeling of mentorship from you, but seeing so many other men doing it made it feel for him he could do it too. All of the things they were talking about, he could talk about. So that was a big breaking for him.
I feel like that's the big permission slip, is when other men say it's okay, because women, we're going to and we get into that almost manipulative phase where we're like, have you seen this? Have you checked this out? Let me show you this thing. And then he's like, okay, I get it. Something's wrong with me, but that doesn't help him get, past that point where he can finally say yes to it necessarily. But when he sees other men doing it that are in his peer group or that he respects, it's oh, okay. Jade, you talk about this a lot. You can mention something 100 times and then he goes down the street to some,
that's what I heard today. Yeah.
I've been saying that for a year.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I think so. Maybe the next step is he has to come out to an in-person weekend, because that's a very different experience. Get offline and get in person and break them down a little bit. But I think it's true. We as men, we organize ourselves in a sort of competitive fashion with one another. And so we're always testing one another and competing with one another. And we're doing it to kind of see where do we fit within the social structure of men. And that's a very integral part of male culture. And so, when men are just surrounded by other men who are can I swear on your show? I just always want to, yeah, okay. When a guy's always around other men who is therapy's for pussies, or, you're whatever the story is, right? You're broken, or there must be something really wrong with you. You must be really fucked up if you need to go to therapy. If a man's just surrounded by that, then he has a perception that he's going to be at the very bottom of the totem pole with his male friends for going and engaging in that behavior. But if he has other men that are around him who are successful, thriving, kicking ass in all areas of life, whether it's business or finances or their health or their relationships, suddenly it's like, oh, actually, maybe I'm going to have a leg up, by going and engaging in that behavior. And so sometimes it just takes them entering into a different sort of pool of men who are engaging in that work and who have a different framework or a different sort of like paradigm. And then all of a sudden it's like, oh, I can do this. I've been curious about this for a long time, and it can open up a lot of doors.
Yeah, it's really beautiful you said that, because I do know someone close to me who actually joined a men's group and then was like, hey, telling one of their friends, like, hey, join this with me. Like, I think you would like it. And the friend did that thing, like shut him down, like, no, I'm good. Like, I don't need that type of help, or I'm not, whatever, that's for pussies or whatever. And then it caused him to not show up to it, the person who's already signed up, which is such a bummer, that can have that influence, but it goes both ways, I guess. So, and we all come to it in the right time, when it is our time. So
Totally.
Beautiful stuff. So I want to jump into this idea that I actually read in your bio, that you refer to yourself as the man who tried to escape his shadow, which I love. So maybe you can tell us a little bit about how you came to being a shadow worker. I think our audience by now has a pretty good idea of what shadow work is. We've talked about it a lot. We talked about it with your wife, so they can go back and listen to that. We don't need the groundwork there, but just on how you got into that.
Yeah, I mean, I think like many men, I got into it by hitting rock bottom. And I think for a lot of guys in our modern culture, where we lack a sense of initiation into a more mature version of masculinity or a more mature version of being a man, we are looking for these initiations to kind of prove to us that we are mature, that we're responsible, that we're trustworthy, not just within relationships, but within the relationship to ourselves. And a lot of guys feel like they can't trust themselves. And that was me. I didn't feel like I could trust myself. I had, grown up within sometimes an abusive environment. There was a lot of confusion about where I fit in within my family system. And on the outside, I looked like I had a great life. I rode a motorcycle, I street raced, I stunted my bike, I had a good career, I was traveling the world, I had a great relationship. I really loved the woman that I was with. But behind the scenes, I was hiding a lot in my life. I was lying about a lot. I was unfaithful. There was a lot of infidelity. There was a lot of addictive behaviors with alcohol and pornography. And so there was sort of like there was this hidden man, that no one really knew about. The women that I dated didn't know, my friends didn't know, my family didn't know. And I couldn't resolve the sort of pain between those two parts of me, the two men that sort of resided within me, the one that I showed people and the one that I hid from people. And eventually that hidden part came out because, I was found out, my girlfriend at the time found out that I was being unfaithful, and, the relationship fell apart. My career started to fall apart. I was questioning everything about who I was and what I was doing and the direction I was taking myself. And, looking back, I realized that I wanted that. I actually was pulling myself towards this rock bottom because I didn't know how to deal with this hidden part of me. And I hated that I had it. I hated that I was out of integrity. I felt out of control. And for a lot of men, they often feel the same way when they're hiding things that they feel out of control of, whether it's, drinking or financial stuff or health stuff or, pornography or stuff in their relationship. They dislike that. They want to be able to have everything sort of out in the open and be transparent because there's a certain strength that comes along with that. And so that, long story short, life fell apart. I started to rebuild. I spent 2.5 years working with a mentor of mine who was versed in Jungian psychology and who taught me a lot about the shadow and taught me about NLP and cognitive behavioral therapy and Buddhism and Zen and just a whole bunch of different components, healing modalities. And I started to rebuild my life. And when I did that, I started to connect with other men in my life. And as I started to tell them my story, as I started to share with them, how I basically fucked my life up and ended up living in the back of my car for a couple of weeks, the men in my life started to come back to me and say, actually, I've been struggling too. I've been dealing with depression. I've been struggling with anxiety. The business that I have that I've been talking about as being so successful is on the brink of bankruptcy. The marriage that I have that I talk about being so great is I'm actually really struggling. We haven't had sex in a year. And so I started to hear the truth about other men's lives. And it came to a head in a conversation with one of my close friends where I told him, how I'd been struggling and what I'd been hiding and what had actually been going on in my life. And this was a man who I was really close with. Like, we were really close friends. And he proceeded to tell me that he had tried to commit suicide a month and a half before he tried to hang himself. And it was such a jarring moment where I was like, I know everything about you. I know the type of scotch you like to drink. I know the TV shows you like, the music you like to listen to. Like, I thought I knew who you were, but I didn't know arguably the most important part of your life, which is that you've been struggling. And you thought you needed to hide that from me. And I thought I needed to hide my shit from you. And that's not how I want to live my life. And that's not how I want to continue to engage with other men in my life. And so I started to see it as a real issue. And so it was sort of like a call to action for me first to do something about that for myself so that I could develop different caliber and quality of relationships with men in my life where I could talk to them about anything, where I could say I'm struggling in my relationship or things aren't as good in my business as I've been saying. And like, I could use some support. I could use some help in actually fixing these problems. And I started to develop those kind of relationships. And that put me on this path of eventually developing ManTalks, which is now like an international men's mental health company. So yeah, that's the long and the short of it.
Amazing stuff. And it actually brings to mind this question that's kind of a personal question, side note here, because of being, we're podcasting here. You've been podcasting for a long time now, and you've been in that limelight and you've been sharing your story vulnerably. And I know for myself, like sharing my own story vulnerably here has been a newer thing for me. And it, took bravery and all the things Brene Brown talks about, or whoever. But I wonder if there is a place where you feel like, because you built a men's group where people can come and do this work in a safe space, how do you decide when is a good place or where is a good place? Like, here we are on a podcast, it's very public, to talk about things that are super vulnerable. And does it ever come with this? Like, sometimes if you give too much information about yourself, it can be too heavy for the person who's receiving it, because of the space that it was delivered in. And then it becomes actually a responsibility that you're handing over to them in a way. And it can be unfair, if that makes sense. Does that come up for you ever?
Not necessarily. Maybe I'll give some context. So, I sort of abide by the general rule that I don't share things that I haven't processed, I haven't digested, I haven't integrated into my being, right? And so I don't necessarily talk about things that I might share things that I'm still working through, but I generally, like my wife and I just had a child, and there were certain parts about that I'm not going to disclose yet because we're still working through it as a couple. We're still coming to terms with it and coming to grips with it. Now, the parts that do feel amicable for me to share and be open about, and it still requires vulnerability and courage, right? I think Brene Brown said vulnerability can't exist without courage. So those parts, I think we have a responsibility to integrate the pain and the frustrations and the suffering and the anger and the grief around those experiences. So I waited for years to talk about that moment of my rock bottom. I waited for years, and I did a tremendous amount of work so that I could get up in front of people and talk about it from a place of not handing over to them the need to try and resolve anything with me, because that's not their responsibility. And I think what generally happens in today's world, where everyone's shit is online, everyone's story is online, people are trying to process their breakups and their divorces and their miscarriages and their cancer and whatever else it is online with other people. And there are some of those things that they should be going through with themselves, with their friends, with their therapists, with their men's or women's group. And then eventually, when it has a certain degree of healing, then they can bring it out to the world. I think the line from me is, if you're bringing it out into the world to try and heal it, it's too soon, right? There is such a thing as sharing too soon. And usually that's the line, is that you haven't integrated or fully understood it, and you're trying to share it as a means of getting that integration, of getting the acceptance. It's like if you haven't accepted it first and you need other people to accept it for you, you're putting the onus of responsibility of your pain on others. And it's part of the challenge that is happening, I think, within the sort of, personal development, self-help industry today. So I really take time to digest the things that happen in my life and try and embody them.
Yeah, that makes sense.
It's like taking the place of integration at times.
Yeah.
Well, it's like a spiritual bypass. Like I'm holding this ugly thing and I don't want to do all the work. So here, like take it. Oh, I'm asking for help, but really I'm not going to do anything with it, or I'm not going to take responsibility for it.
Yeah, well, and that's part of our shadow, right? We have a collective shadow and a social shadow, but I think on an individual level, one of the shadow's favorite games to play is to project itself onto other people, right? And so that's one of the ways that we start to see our shadow. One is through how we are reactive, but two, how we're projecting it onto other people and trying to get other people to take care of it for us, trying to get other people to tend to it. How many times have you been in an argument or conflict in a relationship and you're like, you're pissed off inside, right? You're like angry inside, and the other person's like, you're angry. You're like, I'm not angry, you're angry, right? You're just putting that shit onto your partner and you're like, no, it's not me. But we do that with our own pain in many ways. And we have this, however we want to describe a beautiful, chaotic medium of social media that we can now sort of dump our unconscious contents into. And if we're not careful, what we end up doing is creating a sort of codependency with the people that follow us. And we create a sort of a mesh with the people that are in our communities. And we sort of bring things to them too soon as a means of trying to get some sort of acceptance and validation that maybe we haven't found internally. So yeah.
What would you say, in a lot of our questions are about relationships here, but in relationship or with anybody, if we're in a heated conversation, what would be like the first thing we can, or one of the main things we can ask ourselves to try to figure out if we're projecting or not?
Yeah. So I think first off, what I normally tell people is we underestimate and undervalue the strength that can be yielded and wielded from having rules of engagement within conflict. So most couples, where they go awry is that they enter into a relationship, they start dating, things are going really well, they're in the honeymoon phase, they're having maybe lots of sex, and they're talking all the time, and good nights and good mornings, and all that's going well. And then conflict starts to come in, but they've never actually talked about, how do you engage in conflict? What do you do? What's your shtick? Like when conflict arises, what do you do? Do you shut down? Do you explode? Do you get anxious and sort of like text bomb? Like what actually happens? And so one of the things that I would recommend is create rules of engagement within conflict. What's okay and what's not okay? What are non-negotiables for you? And then as a couple, call yourself out. Know yourself well enough to be able to say, here's probably what I'm going to do when we get into conflict. So when Vienna and I started dating, we did a version of this where I was like, look, when we get into conflict, two things you need to know. One, I grew up in a household where there was a lot of conflict, and so I have a tendency to want to avoid it. And how I will avoid it is by either escalating things very quickly or cutting you down and shutting you out. And so those are the two ways that I'm probably going to do it. And then if I feel like that's not working, I'm going to go into jackhammer mode. She calls it the jackhammer. And I'm basically going to just try and drive my point home over and over and over and over and over again. And that's not about you. That's me projecting my worry, my fear, my insecurity onto you. And so when that happens, just say, I feel like you're jackhammering me. And it'll be a sign for me that maybe I've entered into this space of unhealthy communication. So, but again, that requires a couple to set some of those rules of engagement, right?
My friends, Sarah and Alex, did that at their wedding ceremony in front of everybody. They had shadow vows, like wedding vows.
Yeah.
And you brought up non-negotiables. We also wanted to talk to you about how to set boundaries in relationship around a need without making our partner feel like it's an ultimatum.
I mean, it's a tricky one. I think a lot of people in modern relationships, we bring so much of our attachment style into relationships. And so if you grew up in a household where how you learned how to attach to a parent was by negating or neglecting your own needs, and sacrificing those needs to get your parents' attention, you're likely going to repeat that pattern in a relationship. So you're likely not going to want to set boundaries. So one of the big things that I always talk about is that, you are two entities coming into the third body of the relationship. We often pretend like the relationship isn't this sort of separate entity that's being created through the process of us coming together. And I like to use the word, rather than boundaries, I like to use the word structure. We're creating structure within the relationship. Some people are going to have an adverse effect to even the idea of a boundary, right? Don't tell me what to do. Don't tell me what I can and can't do, right? Or you trying to force me to act like you. So I like to use the word structure. What structure do you need for yourself as an individual in order to feel safe? What structure do you need for yourself as an individual, as a sovereign individual coming into the creation of the third body of the relationship in order to create intimacy, sexual freedom? When was the last time you asked yourself, what structure do I need in my relationship to have sexual fucking freedom? What a beautiful question to ask. Not what boundary, right? Because then all of a sudden it becomes about control.
No, it does sound like that.
Yeah, and we as human beings, we love control. Anytime that we can be in control or relinquish our control entirely is it's like it's just like this alluring song that we love to move towards, that we love to listen to and dance to, because we get to pretend like we have power in that moment. And I usually say where we are desiring or needing control, we are out of power. We're looking for it, but we don't have it. So how do you, or what do you need in terms of structure? That might mean that, like, for example, when Vienna and I were dating, she could have said, I have a boundary that you need to text me every night before bed, because we were doing long distance. So I was on the other side of the country, right? I'm in Vancouver, she's in New York. She could have said, I have a boundary that you need to text me every night before bed. Now, that probably wouldn't have landed very well for me, right? Because I would have been like, oh, you're trying to control me. You're trying to tell me what I need to do in order to be in relationship with you. Rather than what really works for me, what really allows me to feel taken care of and give me healthy structure in a relationship is if you just message me good night before you go to bed, and I'll message you when I get up in the morning.
Yeah.
Great. Okay. I can actually fulfill on that structure. And so I think that it's about the language that we use, right? The language that we use is the technology of our intimacy. It's the vehicle of our intimacy. So if what's that?
That sounds like nonviolent communication.
Yeah, in a way. Yeah. Yeah. And if we're using language that doesn't work, then we're going to create results that we don't like. So I would just say, answer those questions for yourself. What structure do I need in order to have healthy communication? What structure do I need for sexual freedom? What structure do I need to feel connected? What structure do I need in order for intimacy to be present? Some of those questions are going to help you elicit behavioral patterns, modes of communication that you can then sit down with your partner and say, does this feel good for you? Is this workable for you? Is this structure workable for you? Or how would you change the structure? And for a lot of men, that's going to land for them, right? If you tell a man, here's my boundary, he might have a very visceral reaction to that. And same with some women, right? But if you say, hey, does this structure feel good in terms of our communication? That's a very different form of entering into a conversation that they might be more receptive to and that they might understand on a different level. So that's what I would say. If you want to set boundaries, look at the structure that you're actually wanting to create within the relationship, because boundaries create walls. Structure creates the foundation. When we're looking at building the structure, we are actually doing it together rather than I'm setting this boundary for you, to you, on you. And then we need the other person's buy-in, which can sometimes create a natural barrier. Whereas if we're building structure, we're doing it cohesively as a unit. It's like, I want to build the structure of our relationship with you. Are you on board with that? If they're not, probably maybe want to get out of there because they're not bought into the same thing. But yeah.
Yeah, I love that. Mercedes and I are speaking at Terry Cole's Boundary, a little online event tonight, and we've interviewed her. And if I'm being completely honest, the word boundary, and anytime I've set a boundary, I've always felt very bossy while doing it. I've always felt very like coming on strong, but structure feels, first of all, I love structure. So structure feels for me very soft. And that might be because I've had such a hard time setting boundaries. It's something that I've had to work on. And as a kid, I had no structure. So I've like thrived in structure now. So that may be where that comes from. But I wanted to ask maybe if you could elaborate on what you mean by sexual freedom and what structure may look like there for a couple.
Okay. Yeah, I just want to say one thing before. Sometimes there are moments where it is a boundary, right?
Mhm.
Where we can literally say like that's a boundary for me. That's a wall. That's actually a hard no. That's not workable for me. And that's where I feel boundaries can come in to really just like you're bumping up against something that isn't actually workable for me in this relationship. So I just wanted to sort of put that
Yeah,
out
and
there.
just to interject on that, I'd say that whether it's you're almost using boundary as ultimatum in that sense, right? When you're just like, this is the way, this is my need, and it is my need.
Yeah.
Yeah. And for me, it's a matter of like coming from, okay, take some time with it, obviously consider it for a while before you come with something that's that firm. But once you've considered it, is it a reasonable request to ask in a relationship and all that, and then you can come and say, this is what I need from you. It is not really a negotiation at this point. We've tried to negotiate here and there and whatever, and here we are.
Yeah.
And this is my core bottom line need. So it is an ultimatum. So I guess that would mean that ultimatums are okay when you have done the work to make sure it's not you just trying to be power hungry or something.
Right. Yeah. I usually like to say that like boundaries define the extremities of the relationship, and the structure makes up the actual architecture. So the structure makes up the communication and the intimacy and what your future looks like together. And the boundaries are like, here are the non-negotiables that when we cross it, we exit the relationship. We actually step outside of the edges of how I define a relationship.
Yeah.
And so that way it gives a little bit more coherence. But to get back to your question around sexual freedom, I think it's first maybe important to talk about intimacy and what intimacy actually is. And so the etymology, I'm going to get a little nerdy here, but the etymology of intimacy comes from the Latin word intimus. And intimus means into me, I see, basically innermost, right? So when you translate intimus into English, it means innermost. And so the Greeks actually believed that intimacy was about understanding your own inner architecture first. It was about going within to our deepest depths and degrees to be able to extract and elicit and understand what it is that we actually wanted, desired, feared, were insecure about, craved, and then to be able to pull that out and share that with another, with them doing the same thing. Now, this isn't an ideal case, okay? This is sort of like the best case scenario, right? Most of us are dealing with a lot of stuff, narratives around our bodies, narratives around, what's okay for a man to do or not do, or how he's supposed to act sexually in the bedroom. And same with a woman, right? What's okay for her to do or not do, or how she's supposed to act, etc. And so in order for us to find a quality of sexual freedom, we need to be able to go innermost. We need to be able to understand, what is it that I am desiring, that I'm seeking, that I'm craving, in order to liberate me in a sense. What am I wanting to experience and explore with another person sexually? Maybe that's different positions. Maybe that's being tied up. Maybe that's exploring fantasies or fetishes. But whatever it is, to be able to extract that information and then to be able to say, okay, in order for me to bring this forward to my partner, because, if somebody has a certain fantasy about being dominated in a very specific way, it can be really confronting to say, I want you to do X, Y, and Z to me. I want you to tie me up in this way and say these things to me and do these things to me. That is incredibly vulnerable. Or to be on the other side to say, I want to dominate you in this way. That still takes a tremendous amount of courage, because we have looked down on, and there's a sort of cultural wound with the dominator culture. And so for us to stand in that position and say, I want to be dominant, I want to explore some of these fantasies, is quite confronting. So first we have to know, what is it that I want to explore? What is it that I want to experience? And a very simple way of doing that is by asking yourself the question, what is it that I want to experience and feel with my partner during sex? Just one word, right? So like, what's one word how would you both feel around
Closeness, like
closeness?
closeness.
Okay.
Yeah.
So closeness, Jade.
God.
Okay. Yeah. God, it's great.
Yeah. Access.
Perfect.
Yeah.
Yeah. So divinity in a way, God in a way, right? Closeness. So then you can say, well, if I want to feel God in sexual connection with my partner, what structure do I need in order to fully let go or to fully surrender or to create the experience of me being able to connect with God in that moment? Because there's a very specific kind of security, safety, and structure that you need, I would imagine, if I was working with you and your partner, that you would need in order to feel that. There's also a certain kind of structure within the physical connection. So what kind of structure do you need physically in order to experience that? Maybe you need him to hold you a certain way or take you in a certain way or look at you in a certain way in order to connect you to that feeling. So the first thing is we have to get very clear on what we want to feel. The next thing is we have to know what structure we need in order for that to be possible, in order for that to unfold. So those are the things that I would just lay out for people to start with. I won't necessarily go much further than that.
Yeah. And to close off the topic of boundaries as well, I read something on your social about something around setting boundaries doesn't necessarily mean isn't about being right. And your caption was amazing on that. But I didn't know if you could maybe close off the topic of boundaries with just that, maybe elaboration on that topic.
I think we've largely confused in our modern culture the intersection between providing ourselves with what we need, leading ourselves, protecting ourselves, with being right. We've associated those two things together. So rather than saying I am creating this structure or setting this boundary because it's what I need from a place of security or safety, or it's what I need in order for intimacy to be possible, or it's what I need in order for me to thrive, our ego gets in the way. Our ego becomes attached to the outcome. I'm setting this boundary because I want to be right. So in a lot of relationships, one of the most damaging things that we can do is to aim for victory above all else. And this is a very masculine quality. And I see a lot of men doing it. I see a lot of women doing it. And so we start to use all of this sort of pathological language, right? This psychoanalytical language as a means of one-upmanship, of like, I've read the books and I have the language, and so I'm going to set this boundary with you. But what we're actually doing behind that is saying, I am creating a space where I'm right, you're wrong. I'm victorious, you lose, and I get to stay in an invulnerable power position. I get to stay in control. So I never have to relinquish control. I never get my needs truly met, and I get to continue to be disappointed in what's happening in our relationship. And it dissolves and erodes the intimacy, because for many people, this power dynamic or control dynamic, as I would say, exists within a lot of their relationships. Like, why aren't my relationships working? I date these guys. They're all really nice guys. They're great guys, but it never seems to work. And I don't understand why. It's like, well, it's because in some ways you're using boundaries, you're using this tool as a means of being a wall. And this is why I like structure versus boundaries. So notice if your ego's in the way. Notice if you're trying to be victorious over connection. Are you prioritizing being right over being happy, right? This is like the cliche saying, you can either be right or you can be happy. And in some ways, when it comes to relationships, it's true. You can either be victorious or you can create intimacy, right? For some relationships, you can be victorious and have a lot of sex, and you can have a lot of power dynamic based sex, but you're likely going to be missing that intimacy component. And when we are trying to use boundaries as a means of being right, we are legitimately just staying in an invulnerable position, and it's hard for us to realize that. And so we also need to have a partner that we can sort of put ourselves in the position of coming off of our pedestal of rightness. And that's for men and women alike. We all love being right because it provides safety. We all love it. And so we have to come off of it. And, this is something that my wife and I have experienced, because both like being right, and we're both very smart people, and we both have massive personalities, and we both have pretty big egos. And so I'm speaking from a very real place of experiencing what it's like for me to check my own ego and realize that sometimes I'm setting boundaries and trying to implement control as a means of being invulnerable and just winning an argument, winning a battle, and continuing to sort of be in competition with the partner.
That's really good. And it reminded me of something else that you said when it comes to being right. You said something like debating is the modern man's version of mental masturbation. It's like the ego jerking itself off.
Yeah, I use descriptive language apparently.
Yeah, it's very visual.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, the ego likes to reinforce itself, and when we feel insecure, we, men and women alike, it's just a human thing. When we feel insecure, we want to reinforce our sense of perceived strength, and so we can use debate as a means of, again, staying in a position of invulnerability. You never have to be invulnerable when you're competing with someone. You never have to be vulnerable, sorry, when you're competing with someone. You never have to really engage in true intimacy when you're debating somebody, because you can dehumanize the other person. And culturally, this is what a lot of relationships have devolved into, is that we don't know how to rehumanize our partners, right? I just want to let that sink in. So many people are in relationships, and the biggest problem that they have is that as soon as conflict comes up, they dehumanize their partner. They make them other. They objectify them in a very real way. And that objectification then justifies them yelling, calling them names, shaming them, projecting onto them, being aggressive, shutting them out, ghosting them. I mean, any number of things. And we can cut ourselves off from just being empathetic and actually connecting to our own internal experience. So that's all I would say is we as individuals need to lead ourselves more effectively. It's our responsibility. When we make our partners responsible for our sense of wholeness, happiness, okayness, sexual satisfaction, we're in a losing game, because we have turned them into an object of something that we've tasked them with something. It's like, I expect you to make me happy. I expect you to make me come a certain way. It's like, well, okay. It's like, that's a very challenging space to be in. And maybe it's fun for a while. And, maybe there's a place for that in the relationship, of course. But as a foundation for a relationship, it is a recipe for disaster. Dehumanization of our partner is a recipe for disaster, and that's where the four horsemen of the apocalypse come in. And we'll just pause there.
Or it's like the opposite of making ourselves responsible for their happiness, where you posted about that saying, happy wife, happy life, being like a pretty much a codependency saying. And I to be completely honest, I liked that saying because
I love the honesty.
Was happy. She got to, run the show pretty much and get out the couch and all that stuff. So it didn't occur to me that anything was wrong with it until I saw your post. And then I was like, dang it, that's true. But I don't want to agree with it. And the saying that also that it reminded me of was how many men say in front of the children, if mama ain't happy, nobody happy, or if mama's not happy, nobody's happy, or whatever the saying is, and how it, can affect their mindset into thinking in this codependent way. But I'm curious why those sayings are so popular.
Oh boy. Well, that's a big question. I think I'll try and condense it down to, we as men have in some ways done ourselves a disservice and done women a disservice by trying to be the purveyors of your experience. We let our ego get so far out of hand that we pretended for a period of time that we knew what was best for you, that we knew what was better for you than you do. And we stopped listening to the wisdom of the feminine, not just within you, it happened within us first. We cut ourselves off from the wisdom of the feminine within. We stopped listening to our intuition. We over-indexed the rational mind, the masculine qualities of our psyche and of our identity, and we extracted anything from our soul that we quantified or qualified as feminine, and then said, "But I know what's best for you." and I can create that for you, right? Our egos got so out of hand that it was like, I can provide everything for you. You never need to worry. You never need to have any wants or any desires. I can figure it out, right? It's like the masculine desire to solve every fucking problem in the universe, to know every ounce of information is part of the masculine desire. But
The
it's an
deep
illusion.
magician. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. It's the dark side of the magician, right? It's the shadow of the magician. Because the true magician realizes that the beauty of the universe is in its mystery, which is a huge part of that shamanic tradition, right? Is that you can't possibly know everything. So I know that's sort of a very grand way of viewing it, but it's, if I just bring it back down into the individual, it's that we as men have disqualified the feminine attributes within ourselves and seen them as weaknesses rather than contributors to our capacity to be strong men in the world. And that's what an embodied man looks like. It's not somebody who is only masculine, but someone who is able to connect to the feminine attributes within him and have them contribute to his masculine qualities and to his ability to be of service to himself, to his family, to his partner, to his kids, to his society, his community, his work environment. And for him to literally bring himself out into the world, not just certain parts of him. I think there's a great quote by Einstein. It's one of my absolute favorites. He said that the rational mind is a faithful servant and the intuitive mind is a sacred gift. And we have created a culture that honors the servant and has forgotten the gift. So we honor the rational mind in our very masculine oriented culture, but we forgot to really honor the gift, which is the intuition. And so as men begin to develop that intuition, what they realize is, what it is that you need best, actually. I can never know, whether that's you as my wife, as my partner, as, my parent, as my friend. I can never really know. I might think that I know, but that's just an illusion. That's just pretend. That's just my ego wanting to get itself off and be righteous and feel special, right? We live in a cult of specialness in our society. And so when we can start to let that part go, we can humble ourselves within our capacity to say, your happiness is yours. I can influence it and I can impact it as your partner, certainly, because if I'm a miserable fuck, I'm probably not going to be very happy to be around, and it's going to impact your mood. But I am not responsible for, I do not control, and I certainly do not own your state, your experience, your happiness. And embedded into that saying, happy wife, happy life, is the belief that I own your experience as my wife and that I am fully responsible for it. So if you're not happy, whose fault is it? It's mine. And then I get to be the victim, and I get to victim puke all over our relationship and be the bad guy and be resentful. And I do everything for you. And, you're still never have blah, 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 blah. And we get to play the victim. So it's a hard thing, especially for men to come into contact with, because it's a wake up call.
Yeah. Oh, that's good. Oh, Mercedes, your microphone's off.
Sorry about that. Really great stuff though, Connor. It feels like, and it almost, I want to bring all of this together that we've been talking about here and ask you to give us some tangible tools. I think you're the right guy to ask this to be able to call ourselves out when we're doing that codependent pattern, like you're talking about here, or when we're, trying to be right and trying to win. And that's creating a war instead of connection with our partner. And, we're getting into that mode of cherry picking in order to be right, and getting defensive. And so what are tangible tools we can actually use from this discussion with you? Yeah. Take it forward from here.
Yeah, we'll move from the existential into actionable. That's good. That's good. You can just put that at the beginning of the podcast. If you don't want any existential relationship conversations, just skip to the end. The goods. Okay, so let's talk tangible. So the first thing that you can do, one of the best things you can do, is begin to understand your reactivity. Where do you become reactive? So reactivity, as I define it, is an unconscious reaction to stimulus. So your partner says something and you automatically react with anger, with aggression. You shut down, you become passive aggressive. That's reactivity. That reactivity is there to First off, it's a neon sign pointing to your shadow. So your reactivity is indicating that you are consciously not responding anymore. You are reacting from fear, insecurity, pain, worry, inferiority, some combination of that. So the first thing that you need to do is spend an entire month beginning to notice your reactivity. When does it show up? Where does it show up? With whom does it show up the most? Why does it show up? What triggers it, right? So is there certain things that your partner says or does? Is there, when you try and initiate sex and he or she is, sort of interested but not interested, and all of a sudden you blow a gasket, right? You like lose your shit and yell or shut down. You're like, fine, fuck it, I don't want it anyway, or whatever the case may be. That reactivity, get to know it intimately, because it is the saboteur of your intimacy. It is the sabotager of your relationships. So get to know your reactivity. And I gave you some very specific pieces. Spend a month with it, notice it, and finally ask the people in your life when you get reactive.
That's almost a better one than the
Yeah. If you really want to know,
one.
if you really want to know, go ask your partner, go ask your siblings, go ask your friends, go ask your family. Say, when do you think that I get reactive? When does it seem like I get hijacked emotionally, mentally, physically? And they will tell you. And then listen and begin to inquire with what that feels familiar to, because that has origins in your past, that has origins in your family system and your upbringing, and maybe in your past relationships, specifically where you've been abandoned or neglected. So reactivity is number one. The second thing that I would say is begin to autocorrect. So autocorrection, as I'm referring to it here, is begin to notice the behavior, whether it's communication, whether it's structure, whether it's intimacy. Begin to autocorrect the behavior that you no longer wish to exert or put out into your relationship. So for example, if you know that you're avoiding hard conversations with your partner, catch yourself in the moment of that avoidance. You're like, oh, I'm avoiding this conversation. I know I want to have it, but I'm avoiding this conversation. So autocorrect. Maybe the first part is you text a friend and you say, I'm avoiding this conversation right now. And I just need to label. I just need to say it out loud that I'm avoiding this conversation. Okay, well, what would be the next step from there? Maybe the next step from there is that you go and tell your partner and you actually say, I'm avoiding a hard conversation with you. I'm avoiding broaching this conversation with you because the story I'm telling myself is that you're going to X, or what's going to happen is Y. So begin to autocorrect the behavior that you think or know is in some ways keeping you from connecting and engaging with your partner. I think that's one of the biggest things.
The story I'm telling myself feels like
Yeah.
it's really key there too. I wish there was like an autocorrect button that I could buy and install.
Yeah, well, I think that brings me to the last piece, which is start to identify the skills that maybe you haven't developed within your relationship to make them successful. We aren't all, most of us, I don't think any of us really are given the entire skill set for healthy relationships. Maybe some of us have secure attachments and we grew up in an environment with secure attachments. Maybe some of us know how to have confronting conversations, and that's great. Maybe some of us know how to communicate what we want sexually, but most people have not been given the full tool set. So the best thing that you can do for yourself is to identify what skills in my relationship. Setting boundaries is a skill. Communicating what you want sexually is a skill. Being vulnerable is a skill, right? All of these things are skills in a relationship that we can actually learn and cultivate. And sometimes the best thing we can do for ourselves, if we really want to make progress, is to identify what skill we actually know we haven't developed. And a good way to do that is by looking back at your previous relationships and saying, what was actually missing on my side, not on the other person, but what did I contribute to the relationship to cause the erosion, the breakdown of the relationship, and what skill might that be? And then you can implement that. You can implement the training and the development of that skill.
Yeah, I feel I have those skills that you listed, but I know the skill that I am lacking that is detrimental for relationships is being a conflict buster. Like I give my boyfriend all the credit when it comes to, he's always the one that comes to me to solve the conflict. I never go to him. And it sounds like pride, but I genuinely feel like I don't have that skill. And I've learned so much from watching him do it. And I am working on moving from anxiously attached. He's been secure attached. But when I was with an avoidant, I was the conflict buster, you know, because I was the anxious, he was the avoidant. I was always activated by him. So it's interesting that now that I'm with a secure, it seems like all of a sudden I don't know how to be the conflict buster. You know, it's how it switches like that is interesting.
What do you get out of being in that space? What does it keep you from? Being
rejected. Like if I try to go conflict, I guess maybe because in the avoidant, I was always rejected. Maybe I'm used to that response that now I'm, went through that for 4 years, that now it's like so much of what I'm used to, I expect it. But I know that my partner would not reject me. He would love if I would be the conflict buster.
Well, and in some ways you get to stay in control because you get to stay in this power position because you know that he's going to come to you. And I think that there's probably some form of healing in that, because before you were always the one that had to run to the avoidant and try and convince them.
Yeah.
And so now you get
the worthiness.
So now you get to be in that power position. So I think the leveling out of that for you, the healing of that anxious attachment for you, is to be the one that in some cases starts to lean into that discomfort of humbling yourself in some ways and reminding yourself by doing it that it's actually okay, that you're safe in that dynamic. Because what I heard you say is that you know that he's secure and that he can receive that from you. But I think that in some ways you're almost like putting him through penance for what your past partner did.
Yeah, for sure.
So maybe a conversation to own that part after our call today with him.